Hello and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Sarah Cantillon. I'm the director of the Wise Centre for Economic Justice, and I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us for the 5th annual Ailsa McKay Memorial Lecture. This is a key annual event for the Wise Centre. It is named in honour of our founder, Ailsa McKay, and is a tribute to her academic work in feminist economics, her activism, and especially her success in influencing policymakers in Scotland on gender equality issues around childcare, basic income and gender budgeting. We began this series in 2016, 2 years after Ailsa passed away, and we have been very honoured to have had an illustrious line of guest speakers come to Glasgow for this event. The inaugural lecture was given by Professor Nancy Folbury on patriarchal capitalism, and we have since had Professors Philip Van Parigi on basic income, Stephanie Seguino on race and inequality, and Rhonda Sharp, who gave her lecture on gender budgeting on the eve of the IAFI conference that we hosted here in Glasgow in 2019. Unfortunately, like many other events, we had to postpone last year's lecture due to the COVID pandemic. We didn't want to let another year go by, so that's why we're having the lecture as an online event. And it's great because so many of you across so many countries can join us. I suppose my only regret in not being able to host tonight's lecture face-to-face is missing out on the chat afterwards over a glass of wine with James and with all of you. So hopefully we'll be able to do that next year. I'll pass you over now to our invaluable visiting professor to the Wise Centre for many, many years, Professor Diane Elson, who is going to introduce tonight's guest speaker, the inimitable James Heinz, Andrew Glynn Professor of Political Economy at UMass Amherst. Thank you again to all of you for joining us, and over to you, Diane.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Professor James Heinz to give the 5th annual lecture in memory of Ailsa McKay. Ailsa was a dear friend and colleague taken from us much too soon. A scholar, a teacher, a feminist, a public intellectual with a commitment to equality and social justice. And it was she who invited me to become visiting professor at the Wise Centre. And I'd anticipated many years of productive collaboration with her on annual visits to GCU. Alas, it was not to be, and we can only commemorate her and try to carry on the work she started. Now, James is a friend and colleague with whom I've collaborated fruitfully over a number of years and who works at the cutting edge of feminist economics and also knows where to find the best bars wherever we're at a conference. As Sarah said, he holds the Andrew Glynn Chair of Economics at the University of Massachusetts and is chair of the Department of Economics there. James has written on a wide range of economic policy issues, including labour markets and paid employment, the distributive consequences of macroeconomic policies, the intersection between economics and human rights, and the importance of investing in people. I'll just single out 2 items from his long list of publications, 2 books. The first, Rethinking Economic Policy for Social Justice, The Radical Potential of Human Rights, which James co-authored with Radhika Balakrishnan and myself, and The Economy's Other Half, How Taking Gender Seriously Transforms Macroeconomics, in the Agenda series on the gendered economy, edited by myself and Sarah. James has worked on collaborative projects with numerous international institutions, including the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, the International Labour Organization, the Human Development Report Office, and the South African Human Rights Commission and UN Women. He is an associate editor for the journal Feminist Economics and serves on the board of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And you may also be interested to know that James has Scottish heritage. Maybe the clue is in that name. Anyway, his full name is James Sinclair Heinz, Sinclair from his paternal grandmother's side, and I know he's very much enjoyed visits to Scotland in recent years. He's given us an intriguing title for his talk, Confessions of a Rotten Kid, Reflections on Feminist Economics and the Future of the World. And I'm really looking forward to learning what this is all about. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Sarah, for that really warm introduction. And it's really fantastic to be here. I couldn't make it to Glasgow for the reasons that Sarah has explained. So I thought I would bring Glasgow to my Zoom box. So I have the picture of GCU in my background. So I'm in Glasgow in spirit, although I'm told that the weather is not nearly as nice as appears in this picture. I'm going to just share my screen right now and start in on the presentation. Okay, as Diane has said, my talk today is entitled Confessions of a Rotten Kid, Reflections on Feminist Economics and the Future of the World. But first, just a word of thanks. Just thanks to the Wise Center for Economic Justice and GCU for this invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to have been asked to give the 5th annual Ailsa McKay lecture. I did not know Ailsa McKay very well, but it's clear that she saw economics and feminist economics as a way to make the world a better place. She thought that you couldn't really talk about economics without also talking about politics. And academics had to be blended with activism. The point wasn't just to understand the world, but to ultimately change the world. And so I very much aspire to be the kind of economist that Ailsa McKay was. So in the title of my talk, I promised you a confession. And so I'm going to take a deep breath, and here it goes. My name is James Sinclair Heinz, and I am a rotten kid. Okay, so what am I talking about? What is that reference about? It's referring to Gary Becker's Rotten Kid Theorem. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Gary Becker's work or the Rotten Kid Theorem, let me explain the reference. So the Rotten Kid Theorem basically argues that you have a benevolent household head. It's kind of implied that it's a male household head. And then the rest of the household members, the kids, and also the spouses, are self-interested. They're selfish. And so what this benevolent, altruistic household head does is he bribes rotten kids to make choices that are better for all the household members. So why try to do this? Well, the idea, kind of what I read as the motivation behind the Rotten Kid Theorem, is to try to produce a consistent and single set of choices and behaviors for the household as a whole, almost as if the household had a single set of preferences where no one really disagreed. In neoclassical economic theory really focuses on this idea of having a single unified set of preferences for households. For instance, the whole theory of demand in economics is based on the idea that households have some type of unified preferences in terms of the goods and services they purchase in the markets. And a lot of social welfare thinking in economics, neoclassical economics, also aspires to this idea that we should be able to come up with some type of single ranking of all the possible choices that we as a society have. If we could do that, it would make public policy analysis and public choice a lot easier. Unfortunately, we do disagree. Now, I have to explain the picture that you see, the photograph that you see on this slide. It's actually a picture of me and my friend and colleague, Radhika Balakrishnan. And it's a picture of us performing an economic literacy workshop where a lot of the participants in this particular workshop were activists from indigenous communities in the US. And one of the exercises that we came up with in the workshop would be for me to play the part of Gary Becker and for Radhika to be J.P. Morgan. So I was representing the neoclassical economist. She was representing the vested economic interests. Now, we know that Gary Becker and J.P. Morgan were not contemporaries, but the whole point of the role-playing exercise. We could fantasize a little bit. You see the real Gary Becker and the real JP Morgan on the screen behind us. And so the point of this would be the participants in the workshop would advance their own policy positions to Gary Becker, myself, and JP Morgan, Radhika. And then we would respond as if we were Gary Becker or JP Morgan. It was a really fun exercise. The participants got really worked up. At one point, I thought they were going to climb over the table and actually attack us. And I had to remind them that I really wasn't a Gary Becker. Now, I'm sure Gary Becker would not have appreciated this particular exercise. But as I've already told you, hey, I'm a rotten kid. So Becker's Rotten Kid Theorem, it's the story of an altruistic household head. We can think of it as a father knows best type of story who gives gifts to elicit certain behaviors to other household members. What I argue is that the Rotten Kid Theorem needs an extreme makeover. And I actually have an idea for kind of a nerdy reality show where we take kind of antiquated economic theories that are still being taught and being used in a widespread kind of way. And in the course of this reality TV show, we give them an extreme makeover. So by the end of the show, they come out completely unrecognizable, but a lot better. So I'm gonna give you an extreme makeover of the Rotten Kids Theorem. What I'm going to interpret this idea of pursuing unified preferences and consistent actions, I'm going to interpret that in terms of adherence to particular norms, particular gender roles, and particular rules. Now, Gary Becker stresses giving gifts to people, carrots, positive incentives, but sticks, such as punishment, sanctions, violence, might actually be more important. That's my argument. So my version of the Rotten Kid Theorem, the James Heinz version, is as follows, that behaviors that violate particular norms are going to be subject to punishment. And that punishment might just be withholding of various benefits by communities and households to enforce actions and choices consistent with those particular norms. These actions and choices can produce outcomes similar to those that are going to be associated with a common sense set, a unified set of non-conflictual preferences. So that's my version of the Rotten Kid Theorem. So to get back to kind of a personal connection to the Rotten Kid Theorem, here's a little autobiographical note. So why am I a rotten kid given this revised Rotten Kid Theorem? Well, I realized that I was gay as a teenager, and this was back in the 1980s, kind of a scary time. The timing is important because it was the height of the fear associated with a very different virus than the one that we're currently confronting. It was kind of the height of the fear around the HIV epidemic. So it was a scary time for me. And people like me were seen as violating norms of pertaining to sexuality, gender identity, and gender norms. And we were, at that time, I would argue, subject to some extreme sanctions in terms of what I'm calling my revised Rotten Kid Theorem. So let me just tell you one story from me in my 1920s. One night I was at a gay bar in a small town in upstate New York, and a friend of mine, not a close friend of mine, but someone I knew from the community, an older guy, actually suffered a heart attack in that bar. And so people immediately called 911. And what happened was that the ambulance, the emergency rescue, never showed up. They would not come to that address. And this friend, this member of the community, passed away on the floor of this kind of dirty dive bar. And that said to me, the lesson that I took from that is that I, for being a rotten kid, would not have the same rights or access to even the same basic social protections, such as emergency medical care, as other people take for granted. That's a pretty extreme sanction, in my opinion. So we're in 2021. Things have changed a lot since the 1980s. But I still would argue that, these sanctions associated with being a rotten kid are still with us. So one way that households can enforce these norms of if you happen to be a rotten kid is to kick you out of the household altogether. And so here's just some statistics. An estimated 24% of homeless youth in the UK identify as LGBT. Up to 40% of homeless youth in the US identify as LGBT. So being kicked out of the household is a reality for many LGBT people. A recent US study by the Williams Institute, just another stat, found that 17% of LGBT adults were homeless at some point in their lives. And it's not just being kicked out of the household, there's sanctions in terms of just mental distress of having a non-conforming identity. LGBT youth are 5 times, for instance, in the US, more likely to have attempted suicide than heterosexual youth. Now, a lot of these statistics that I'm giving and the examples I'm giving are from the global north. But these are global issues. The image that I have on this screen is of Brian Waswa. Brian Waswa was an LGBT activist in Uganda who struggled against laws in Uganda, such as capital punishment for homosexual acts, and was murdered in 2019 for his activism. So, and some extreme sanctions. Now, I'm focusing on LGBT examples right now because I have a direct personal connection to those. But we could talk about gender-based violence as well, and gender-based violence being used against people who violate gender norms, gender roles, or adopting gender non-conforming identity. We can my Rotten Kid Theorem to these issues as well. So I always, when I started studying economics, I really wanted to understand these dynamics. Why was there such hatred directed against people like me? What really is at stake? And I was convinced that there was a material foundation. I mean, I think of myself as a pretty charming, approachable guy. I'm pretty cute, but why would so many people have such deep-seated hatred directed at me for who I actually was? So my initial answer when I first started thinking about this was thinking about patriarchy as male dominance. So my narrative went something like this, that being gay challenged the dominance of men over women. In particularly sex between men really threw a wrench in the works in terms of the logic of male dominance. And so homophobia became a way of preserving men's social and economic dominance. I still think this is part of the story, but changes in norms and institutions since that time have made me rethink this. In particular, there's a challenge to this way of thinking from trends with respect to gay marriage and comparing them with respect to trans and reproductive rights. So let me give you an example from that I was struggling with around the time of the IAFE conference, the International Association for Feminist Economics conference, that happened in Galway, Ireland. So that conference took place in 2016. And what had happened right prior to that conference in Ireland is that gay marriage was legalized. That happened in 2015. But at the same time, abortion was still banned in Ireland. So reproductive rights were very, very restricted, even though we saw a movement in terms of gay marriage. Now, with my earlier understanding, these things should have been really closely correlated with each other, but they weren't. And so this caused me to take a moment to try to rethink my approach to these issues. And what I've decided is that, marriage is a core patriarchal institution. And so extending the right to marriage to a larger group of people really wasn't that threatening. It's a little like that joke. So let me tell you the joke. It goes something like this. I don't see why everyone's making such a big fuss over same-sex marriage. Aren't all marriages same-sex marriages? I mean, it's the same sex over and over and over again. So the point is that marriage in itself is not threatening. But the real threat comes from changes in control over reproduction, particularly women's control over the means of reproduction. By that, I mean their own bodies, and broader control over sexuality. And so I'm expanding my original understanding as patriarchy as male dominance to really thinking about control over reproduction. The reason for this is that there's actually a lot of stakes. So estimates that assign a monetary value to unpaid care work, kind of the non-market part of the reproductive economy, typically come up to with figures in the range of 20 to 40% of GDP. Now we can talk about how you actually assign these monetary values. There's a lot of methodological debate around this, but typically they come up with a magnitude roughly in this range, 20 to 40% of GDP. How big is that? Well, one way of thinking about this is that 20 to 40% of GDP is the same order of magnitude as the entire public sector in most countries. And the public sector represents another non-market sector. Economists would never ignore the public sector in their analysis, but they routinely ignore the reproductive care economy. Political economists too, they often talk about state capture, special interest in terms of the public sector, political battles over control of the state, but we need to apply kind of the same framework to the reproductive economy. So we need to start to begin to talk about care economy capture or control over social reproduction. Collective economic interests are as relevant in terms of the reproductive economy as they are for the public sector. So what does all of this have to do with rotten kids? Getting back to the Rotten Kid Theorem, my version of the Rotten Kid Theorem. Well, the cost of keeping the reproductive economy going fall primarily on women. And so under these conditions, with this disproportionate distribution of the cost of social reproduction, we need to somehow, the institutions are put in place to ensure that women participate in the reproductive economy. This includes norms supporting the gender division of labor, with women specializing in unpaid care work, men in market-oriented work, norms valuing motherhood or marriage, and norms against things like divorce, extramarital childbearing, or norms against cohabitation outside of marriage, help kind of reinforce women's role with respect to the reproductive economy. To add to that, we have unequal access to assets. Women have unequal access to assets and ownership of those assets. There's biased inheritance laws and restricted opportunities in the paid labor market. So all of these things, these norms combined with these economic distributive factors mean that marriage and childbearing become an economic survival strategy for women in a very traditional patriarchal context. But as outside options outside the household begin to change for women, the economic imperative of participating in the reproductive economy weakens. How I would describe this and using my Rotten Kid Theorem is the number of rotten kids, the number of women making choices that run counter to traditional gender roles, gender norms, and patriarchal institutions is going to increase. So the impact of this increase in the number of rotten kids, rejecting kind of the standard patriarchal norms and patriarchal roles, there's far-reaching implications for this. But I want to, in this talk today, focus on one of those. One of those being we're witnessing some major demographic shifts with respect to population dynamics and population growth rates. So according to the UN Population Division, just a couple of years ago, made a startling announcement that over half of the world's population now lives in countries with below replacement fertility rates. So we see a dramatic decrease in fertility rates in many parts of the world. And this is unprecedented. This hasn't happened on this scale anytime in history, if we're not talking about a really severe pandemic or kind of war type of situation. And so fewer and fewer women are actually participating in the reproductive economy, or they're participating in it on different terms than they used to in the past. So we're seeing smaller youth populations, and we're seeing a larger share of older persons in terms of just the demographic profile of many countries. Now, we don't fully understand what the macroeconomic consequences of these changes will be, but I want to convince you in this talk that they're likely to be pretty profound. I also want to recognize that demographic patterns in lower income countries often differ than the ones that I've just described, that fertility rates are still high, that you have a larger youth population relative to the older population cohorts. But I would still argue in these countries that these demographic dynamics do have macro consequences. They're just different macro consequences. For the purposes of my talk today, I'm going to focus on the below replacement fertility issues because I'm going to use that as a way of illustrating some of the points I want to make. So economists, particularly the macroeconomists, ignore demographics or make assumptions that render population dynamics inconsequential. It's not just neoclassical economists that do this. Marx also did this, kind of treating population dynamics as being a product of biological proclivities, as opposed to having anything to do with the economy and economic dynamics. Now, one exception to this is Thomas Malthus. You see his picture on this slide. Thomas Malthus is probably best known as being the economics profession's original buzzkill. He's the type of person that you would not want to invite to your party. Thomas Carlyle, a different Thomas Carlyle actually referred to Malthus's theories as being dreary, stolid, and dismal. Some people seized on that and use Malthus's theories as reason for economics getting the label the dismal science. Now, since that time, the economics profession has produced many individuals who could be described as dreary, stolid, and dismal. But Malthus is generally considered to be the first in this long line. But I actually still find Malthus interesting. One of the reasons why I find Malthus interesting is he actually saw a link between economics dynamics of the structure of economies and population dynamics. He got pretty much everything wrong with respect to these relationships, but he did see a connection. So his theory went along these lines, that if incomes were to rise, that the working class would suddenly go nuts and have a lot more children than they would have when incomes were lower. If the working class is having more children, populations are going to grow. As populations grow, it's going to drive down wages, and it's going to drive wages down below the subsistence level, which will produce starvation and death. That starvation and death will kind of keep the population in check. he got that totally wrong. It's kind of a creepy theory if you think about it. And we actually know that, you know, when incomes rise, what we tend to see is fertility rates dropping as opposed to rising. So it's not his specific conclusions that I find interesting, but I do find his recognition that there is a connection between demography and a lot of economic issues to be one worth pursuing at this particular moment. And I'm trying to do work with my colleague and friend Nancy Fulbray, looking at some of these issues in terms of macroeconomic dynamics. So one consequences of these changing demographics has to do with how we kind of think about our social contracts across generations. So past and present social protection arrangements that provide economic support to dependent populations, generally children and older cohorts of the population. Our usual social contracts tend to work best when populations are growing. So if we have the traditional kinship in family relationships in terms of social protection. So this is the type of thing where parents will invest in their children with the understanding that when their children become adults, those adult children will then take care of their aging parents. Well, this type of arrangement tends to work best when the number of children exceed or is at least equal to the number of parents. As a kind of an insurance policy. I'm saying if you have more children than parents, it kind of avoids the King Lear problem. In case one or more of your children decide to default on this kind of arrangement and don't take care of you in your old age, it helps to have a couple spare kids to fill in the gap. But it's also relevant for some modern welfare state arrangements. Many of these which kind of socialize patriarchal kinship arrangements. So one example would be pay-as-you-go pension systems, the type of pension system that we have in the United States, the Social Security system, where you tax the kind of the currently employed and transfer that tax revenue to the retired population, the older generation, to support their incomes in retirement. Now, these pay-as-you-go pensions tend to work best when you have a growing population, meaning that the kind of the quote unquote working age population is larger than the retired population. They tend to come under a lot more strain when you have declining populations in an aging population, where the working age population is actually smaller than the older dependent population, which it's supposed to support. So a lot of our social contracts and our social welfare arrangements have kind of been built on the presumptions that populations are going to continue to grow. We're not going to be in a situation with below replacement fertility and the possibility of having negative population growth. Now, I think it's helpful in talking about these issues to think about, to use a political economy analysis and think about different types of distributive conflicts. And by political economy analysis, what I'm referring to is an approach to analyzing these economic dynamics that puts distribution and power dynamics kind of at the center of its analysis. So classical political economy, including Marxian political economy, emphasize class divisions, capital and labor. Feminist economics, feminist political economists bring in conflict between men and women, or conflict between people with different socially constructed gender identities or different gender roles. Another approach to political economy, stratification economics, emphasizes the conflict between dominant and subaltern or subordinate groups that's defined by group identity, and often stratification economics emphasizes racial identities. The distributive conflict I want to talk about today, though, is about intergenerational conflict. So acknowledging these other dimensions, I want to really focus on intergenerational conflict, asking how do different groups defined broadly in terms of age cohorts, actually stake claims on different shares of resources, incomes, goods, and services in our economies. So I think the current COVID crisis highlighted some of these tensions in a really interesting way, in the sense that there's a strong correlation between the mortality rates due to COVID and age, with older populations being much, much more vulnerable. But the cost of shutdowns of the market economy and the cost of unemployment differ by age cohort. And it's often a younger population that experienced a lot of these costs. So in order to protect the older generation, the economic costs were felt by a younger generation, just as a way of illustrating intergenerational conflict. But more generally, putting COVID aside, below replacement fertility, the prospect of negative population growth raises questions about these links that I wanted to highlight in this talk between demographic change, intergenerational conflict between generations, in macroeconomic stability. I've already alluded to this in terms of our social contracts and social welfare policies. But this notion of intergenerational conflict is relevant not just for the market economy, but also non-market production as well. So here's just to give you some stats on this. These are just taken from the US economy, just to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. These are labor force participation rates by age and sex. You can look at the left-hand side of this. And all this I'm trying to show with this is that in terms of young age cohorts, and so this starts at 16, so it's not looking at anyone below 16 years of age. And older age cohorts, participation in the market economy, rates of participation are much lower for both men and women. And so the productive contributions in terms of income and production of these age groups are lower than those of other age groups. And it's not just the market economy. This is data from the American Time Use Survey. And we really want to focus on caring labor, care for others in this. And this is only showing time use for women, since they perform the bulk of the caring labor. And again, it's done by age cohorts. And so caring for and helping household members, the majority of the caring labor that's performed is performed by women ages 35 to 44, at least in terms of how this data has been parsed out. And much, much lower rates of caring labor for other age cohorts. You see a little uptick there, a green uptick in terms of the category of caring for and helping non-household members. And that's actually an older age category. It's relatively small, but it's bigger than some of the other categories for 75 years old and over. So those are the grandmothers that are helping out in terms of caring for others. But again, the point I'm trying to make here is that the contributions to the non-market economy relative to the needs of the services produced by unpaid labor are going to really differ by age cohort. So there's a class of economic models that I find really interesting that are called overlapping generation models. The early work in overlapping generations asked the following questions. What happens when an older generation stakes a claim on the share of the income or output produced by a younger working age generation? Again, we can debate exactly what working age actually means, but it's in the spirit of those graphs I just showed you. That is larger than their current productive contribution. So what happens when an older generation is kind of staking claim on income produced by a younger generation? So the early work in overlapping generations kind of focused on this question. So this kind of tension, this intergenerational distributive tension, a couple of ways that you could resolve this. It was argued in the literature that you could address this just by private prior savings. So the older generation just saves up for their retirement and uses financial instruments and markets to do that. And then they draw on that savings to finance their consumption once they've stopped working. Again, this depends on your faith in financial markets to be able to preserve that savings over time, but it's one option. It could also be addressed by a social contract along the lines that I've just talked about, something like a pay-as-you-go pension system. But these systems tend to be most sustainable when you have a growing population. I also note that these strategies apply primarily to the market economy, that prior savings, you use that to purchase goods in the marketplace, or a pay-as-you-go pension, again, gives you some income that you use to purchase goods in the marketplace. An older population might also have demand for unpaid care services. This is a big question in terms of elder care, and these strategies don't necessarily address that. So that's the early overlapping generations questions and themes that those approaches were trying to explore. It becomes more complicated when we add a younger dependent population. So this is the children, not just an older population, older generation, but let's say 3 generations, children, kind of the working age population, and then an older age cohort. Children are more complicated because they don't have prior savings. You can't tell them that they should have saved up in financial markets to finance their consumption. Even rich kids aren't going to have access to the assets that they might ultimately own through inheritance, or are able to make decisions regarding the use of those assets. Children can't negotiate binding agreements with regard to how they will be raised. There's no market for parents where children can shop around and find the best parents available. And social contracts, as I mentioned, might not be enforceable, particularly with demographic change. Parents invest in children with the understanding that children will take care of them as they age. That arrangement tends to be most stable with growing populations. And so there's questions over the sustainability of these type of social contracts and investments in children when that's no longer the case. So those are the overlapping generation types of approaches, but we can make things even more difficult. This issue of intergenerational conflict is not only relevant for overlapping generations that exist and live at the same time. I would argue that intergenerational conflicts and intergenerational political economy is also applicable to generations that are yet to be born. And so future generations, talking about future generations. Market-based solutions to the distribution or in terms of current decisions and the impact it has on future generations can't work for many reasons, but I would argue that most importantly, we can't actually negotiate on fair terms with people who do not yet exist. There's really no basis for exchange, and when there's no basis for exchange, there's no basis for market solutions to these issues. Neoclassical economic theory tends to avoid this very thorny problem by assuming that there's some degree of altruism towards future generations, that the current generation automatically cares about the preferences of future generations, which is possible, but it assumes that the current generation actually knows what those preferences would be. Or another way that neoclassical theory deals with this is it assumes that there's only one common set of preferences, same utility function, that individuals maximize over an infinite time horizon. So it's almost as if people live forever. If we can assume that people live forever, it makes these questions of future generations much, much easier to solve. It's very similar to the Rotten Kid Theorem, right? That's trying to force a set of choices that's consistent with a single set of preferences. But I don't think that these tricks that neoclassical economics use to try to deal with the intergenerational conflict are credible at all. What is valued changes with time. preferences and norms we know are not stable, and they shift in unpredictable ways. So I would actually argue that if we're going to extrapolate from this discussion of intergenerational conflicts, that climate change actually probably represents the ultimate intergenerational conflict in many respects. That really the choices that we're making today are going to impact future generations, and those future generations do not have a choice with regard to the decisions we're currently making. It also illustrates some of the limits to the idea of a social contract. So a social contract, kind of the basis for arguing for the existence of a social contract, is that people are going to freely choose to subject themselves to a social contract, to a set of rules, because they're better off doing so than they would be living in a society without rules. But this raises a question: who really is party to these social contracts that we're talking about? Can we talk about, for instance, a global social contract when laws, legal systems vary from country to country, social norms vary dramatically from country to country? We can't really talk about one single unified global social contract, which raises questions about how we address climate change, which is a global phenomena in the context of a social contract. Or what about future generations when they don't have a seat at the table, and so that they cannot determine the terms of those social contracts? So market-based solutions aren't going to work, and our kind of the social contract tradition does not necessarily provide a basis for discussing some of these difficult issues. I think, and this is one of my last points, that all this discussion, these points that I'm trying to raise, and the points that feminist economists have been raising for decades, actually provides a basis for rethinking the sources of economic crisis going forward. So issues such as the reproductive economy, the non-market spheres of our economies being as important as the market spheres, and a broader approach to the interpretation of distributive conflicts help us understand the sources and nature of our current economic crisis and future economic crises. So here's an observation. I'm just going to read this out. Some of the biggest contradictions of our current capitalist systems are not fully contained within the market economy itself, but rather result from the interactions between capitalist processes and the non-market spheres of our economies. And the specific non-market spheres that I have in mind are the care reproductive economy and the environment. The COVID-19 crisis, as many feminist economists have been documenting, really shows the critical importance of the non-market care economy for the kind of the sustainability of our societies. And as I've hinted at, climate crises also, with the environment being an important non-market sphere. The looming climate crisis also shows the interactions between these non-market spheres in a capitalist market economy in a way that's producing crises. Okay, so that was a lot of issues to throw out there. Let me just kind of summarize by connecting some dots. So here's how I think it all fits together. So first, in terms of rotten kids, we have seen enormous change over the past several decades in many parts of the world with respect to gender roles, gender identity, and sexuality. And I think in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, we can see norms changing. But these changes that we're seeing are conflicting with established patriarchal institutions that govern the reproductive economy. And the transformation of these institutions have not kept up. We haven't figured out the solution to new institutions governing the care economy. And the reason why I think change has been slower in this area is that there's an enormous amount at stake, and there's a lot of collective interests involved that are resistant to change. One consequence, I argued, is that of this contradiction between these changing norms and changing behaviors and established patriarchal institutions, as we see changing demographics that are affecting one of our most valuable economic resources, human beings themselves. So what I'm arguing, and what I've argued, is that these changes are affecting the stability of our existing social contracts, our existing kind of social welfare arrangements. They affect macroeconomic outcomes and the nature of macroeconomic crises, and they're affecting how we should think about distributive conflicts. I don't have the full answer to how this is all going to play itself out. I think there's an enormous amount of work that we still need to do, but I think these are the areas that we really need to start investigating. It raises a lot of questions that have huge implications for the future. Will there be adequate investments made in children in the next generation, given these types of distributive conflicts that we're seeing? Are we going to be able to ensure the well-being of older generations moving forward, given these demographic changes, in terms of those generations' access to income, medical needs, and elder care types of issues? Smaller global populations may have some ecological benefits. Fewer people may mean fewer emissions, less pollution, but negative population growth, I would argue, has unknown macroeconomic consequences. We're not sure what this uncharted territory is actually going to look like. And negative population growth cannot continue indefinitely, and I mean indefinitely, without meaning the extinction of Homo sapiens. So there's kind of a contradiction there with social reproduction. And the final point is our ability to recognize and address these intergenerational conflicts is going to be essential for environmental sustainability. But I don't think markets are the solution, or our traditional thinking about social contracts are going to provide a full picture either. So just to wrap up, a big shout out, first of all, to all you rotten kids out there. A big thank you. Because I think it's because of rotten kids, defined in my terms, not Gary Becker's terms. It's because of you that we've seen significant transformations in gender norms, gender identities, attitudes towards sexuality, in many, but not all contexts. There's still changes that are needed. And I think this has been a huge step forward with regard to tackling certain inequalities. But as I've said, economic institutions and arrangements have been slower to change. The contradictions and tensions are really apparent these days. So are the vested collective interests. So there's a real contradiction and tension there between what we're seeing. And just in conclusion, what I would say is the work of feminist economists like Ailsa McKay have provided and will continue to provide insights into the nature of these economic challenges that we're facing and that we'll face in the future. It's time to do something. So again, just hearkening back to where I started this presentation, we need to think about economics linked to politics, not in isolation. We have to tie academics to activisms, to a push for change and transformation going forward. And with that, I am concluding. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very, very much, James. I'll let you get your breath back after that tour de force of a lecture. Thank you very much. And for your provocations, which are absolutely fitting, an Ailsa McKay lecture, never shy of a provocation, was Ailsa. So you have been a perfect accompaniment. And before we get into some of the substantive issues that you've addressed, you ended on a really dynamic note there as well of academic activism. And I just wonder, while others gather their thoughts, what is that for you? What do you mean by academic activism, and how how can you and how can we as academics, academic institutions demonstrate that?
So often how I've just in my career, how I've engaged with that is building connections with activists themselves and with organizations themselves. As I showed you with that slide where it's, I had the Gary Becker mask on, one area that I've been involved in a long time in collaboration with people like my colleague Radhika Balakrishnan has been to actually work with activist organizations in terms of their understanding and their engagement with economic issues. So a lot of my effort would be to take something like some of these issues that I've presented today, bring them to activists working on various issues, whether it's environmental sustainability, whether it's gender equality, whether it's transforming the care economy, and walk through kind of the economic connections with them a bit more. And then learn from their activism and their experiences as well. So it's a two-way street. It's not just being the economic experts that are explaining the theories to the activists, but also listening to the activists in terms of their experiences. So for instance, in the one workshop where the Gary Becker mask was, it was a workshop where a large number of the participants were indigenous populations in the US. And we came to that workshop explaining the role of the state in terms of the economy, and got a lot of pushback because for indigenous people in the US, the state is not the friendly institution. It's actually the oppressive institution. So listening to that and changing the way that we as economists think is also important.
Thank you. That's great, James. And I think absolutely reflects not just the way Ailsa worked, but the way that we try to work at the Y Centre and across GCU, very much working in a kind of co-production sense. And that phrase that you use there, you know, walking through, you know, economic conditions, those lived effects in the community. I've realised I've not introduced myself. I've just added another voice to it. I'm Angela O'Hagan and I'm Deputy Director here at the Y Centre. And I'm very grateful to you all for your attendance today and for the questions that are starting to come in. Farida Khan has asked a question, James, about stratification economics. And Farida says, it appears that this is getting worse in the sense that differences in race and ethnicity are far more on the forefront than they were, and that there is perhaps less resolution to including those rotten kids, or perhaps they're not bribed sufficiently. And what's your opinion on that?
No, I think at least in the US context, and probably more globally, the issues around racial identity have really risen to the floor. As Frida has said, in terms of some of the most apparent kind of use of force and violence to reinforce existing stratifications, and to really kind of push the issue of identity and group identity and collective action in those ways forward. So I think that that's true. That's what we're seeing, at least in the U.S. context. I think in other contexts globally, the issues might be different. In terms of rotten kids, it's a complex issue because there's being able to kind of reject or act outside of racial norms and racial identities is often much more difficult and often very, very costly for doing so. The idea that your identity is ascriptive, for instance, in terms of racial identities, is much stronger than where we're at with, let's say, gender identities, you know, where we have, you know, people, the idea that you are able these days, again, subject to a lot of sanctions, but be able to change in your gender identity is much more broadly accepted than this idea that you can somehow change your racial identity. So the being able to be a rotten kid in terms of the stratification of economics in racial identities, I think is very costly, and it's not moved forward quite as much as with respect to areas of gender or sexuality, I would say.
Okay, thank you. I've got a two-part question to that that leads on from that, James. And one is about racialized inequalities that you've just been talking about, and the consequences of colonized wealth production and human value, and the extent to which that has, those factors have historically and continue to contribute to enduring discrimination. And how, despite the connections that you've made and the rhetoric of climate justice and equality and social justice being so strong from the international institutions and domestic governments, why is there still such ongoing institutional resistance to making the changes you suggest?
Well, I think, as I've said, that when we recognize, when we think about the private sector, for instance, we really clearly recognize that there's certain what are called special interests, rent seekers, however we want to talk about it. When we talk about the public sector, same thing, special interests. We recognize those politics as well. But I think there's a whole areas of our economy, and I focused on kind of the non-market reproductive economy in my talk, that are often ignored, or the politics of them are boiled down to the household. Let's say, some type of bargaining dynamic between men and women, those type of, is brought down to a very micro level. But I would argue that the same types of collective interests that you see operating in the public sector or among corporations or other parts of our economy are reflected in these other areas of our economy that are, but they're not systematically analyzed in those terms. And I think it's the collective interest and collective action that's resistant to that there are, both in terms of, capitalist collective interests, but also collective interests of men as well, are really resistant to change, partly because it's cost a lot of money. I mean, 20 to 40% of GDP, if we're talking about the reproductive economy, is enormous. It's a whole nother public sector. So it's not surprising that we would see vested interests being really resistant to change in that context.
Indeed, yes, vested interest remaining. I'd like to bring together two questions here, one from Lee Badgett and one from Una Walsh, and both of whom start with many thanks for the insightful or fantastic talk, James, which is lovely. And Lee, in her question, talks about how the control that you've been talking about is largely used against women. And she's talking about the potential link to anti-lesbian sentiment and its effects. But is asking how you would connect those dots in relation for gay men or for transgender people. And continuing that idea of control being used against women, Una would like to follow up on your comment about the marriage equality referendum in Ireland and your point about the continuity of institutions such as marriage. And could you say a wee bit more about what you see as the continuities of exclusion and discrimination in feminist economics terms? So some big questions there, trying to bring them together.
So in terms of LGBT and kind of taking the L from the G, the B, and the T. I mean, obviously, people's lived experiences in each of those categories is going to be very, very different. And so treating them as kind of a unified whole, sometimes obscures or erases some of those differences. So, for instance, gay men are relatively privileged in terms of just their identity as men relative to lesbians for that, in terms of kind of the distinction in terms of gender and gender oppression. But in some cases, you know, gay men might actually experience as extreme backlash against them from other men, just because of what they represent as a threat to masculinity, for instance. Or in terms of gay men, as I mentioned, the HIV pandemic was a very defining in terms of that particular community in a way that doesn't always spill over to the lesbian community or the bisexual community, but does to the trans community. And so I think you have to, we can talk about this as a whole, LGBT, but we need to parse it out at the same time. You know, the trans community, by violating norms of gender identity, I think it's distinct from, you know, violating norms of sexuality without violating the gender identity. So, you know, gay men, by not violating cis gay men, by not violating gender identity, protect that bit of privilege, you know, by being men. And so I think we have to really, as I said, separate it out, see where the sanctions hit. The sanctions are going to be different for lesbians, they're going to be different for gay men, different for the trans community. I think it's useful lumping them together because you can see those connections in terms of gender identity, in terms of sexuality, in terms of what I'm calling the rotten kid phenomena. I think the broad framework is useful, but the specific way it manifests itself is going to be different, whether you're talking LG or B or T.
Indeed. Yeah.
In terms of marriage and continuity there, sorry, am I breaking up?
No.
Okay. I actually think, you know, I'm not sure if I fully understood what the question was asking, but I think at some point it became clear that extending marriage rights beyond heterosexual couples was not that threatening to kind of patriarchal institutions, basically extending access to establish patriarchal institutions without necessarily, but then kind of drawing the line there. So, you know, sexual behaviors outside of that are considered inconsistent with marriage, like large numbers of sexual partners or something like that, would still be condemned. And so marriage still serves as a discipline device on sexuality in that respect. And I think it's kind of controlling sexuality, controlling how reproduction takes place, that's really at stake, more than whether marriage is heterosexual, same sex, whether maybe it could be between more than two people as well. Maybe that's not going to be as threatening. We haven't quite gone there yet in terms of those dynamics, but I think it preserves some core control over sexuality and reproduction. I think really that's what hasn't changed so much, or we even see backlash in some countries in terms of women's reproductive rights.
Indeed, yeah, that continuing control, and it takes us back to those institutional structures. A very quick question from Mike Danson is again in relation to Mike's talking about some recent PhD research that Mike and Jim Campbell were supervising, and the findings there that were where gender imbalances in apprenticeships are being addressed, it tended to be through gay men and lesbian women going into non-traditional, for their sex, non-traditional occupations. And Mike was just asking as to whether that confirms the barriers to change. And I think that question reflects the answers you've been giving. I'd like to move us on in the remaining time to two questions again that I'll take together because they're both about care. Veronica Lemier is asking that, in response to, or rather in witnessing the neoliberal responses to the challenge of an aging population, global care chains, and welfare state restraint, we're seeing again other forms of control, things like the. And so she wanted to know really about your opinion on the extension of pension ages and the kind of actions that we're seeing in relation to the poverty of older women. And Rosalind Cavigan has asked that thinking about shifts towards a better understanding of the importance of non-market sectors like the care economy and the prevention of further economic crisis. Rosalind's taking it home for you and asking how meaningful recent moves in the Biden administration to classify care as infrastructure, which is a huge part of our argument here from the Women's Budget Group and elsewhere. So how meaningful the moves by the Biden administration are likely to be.
Okay, so in terms of elder care, changes in pension ages, that set of issues, I think this is at the core of some of the intergenerational conflicts that that I was trying to allude to, that we're going to see more and more pressures for these types of changes. We're going to see pressures in terms of income support, and defining who actually pays for those, for that income support. So extending the for instance, is a way of trying to broaden the base of people paying for the older population, for instance. And so I think that's just a manifestation of the types of tensions that we're going to see. I think one area that we'll probably see even more apart from just pensions is medical care too, as medical care becomes more and more expensive. Elder care is very expensive. Long-term care, all of that raises the question of who's going to pay for that when many of the recipients are no longer contributing as much to the productive economy, as what they demand from the economy is greater than their productive contribution. So that creates all of these types of tensions. And I think these are some of the biggest questions that we actually face going forward. And it's not just about pensions or kind of market medical care, but I also think the unpaid care sector, more and more people are needing to engage in unpaid elder care as well. And that's much harder in the current context to find quick market substitutes for in all cases. So you might have all the money in the world and still need some of this non-market unpaid care as our populations age. So I don't have clear answers on how it's all going to sort itself out. I try to signal that, but I do think it's the area. It's one of these key areas that we really need to pay a lot more attention to, because it's not just about the care needs of particular individuals. It talks about it gets at kind of macroeconomic imbalances in the long run, how we pay for this. It gets at these types of conflicts that we're seeing moving forward with regard to the social contract, or how we think about the welfare state. And so I think all of that it just speaks to those issues. Care is infrastructure. No, yeah, or in thinking of investing in children, for instance, as an investment, not as just a consumption expenditure. You know, a lot of the standard neoclassical models that do try to incorporate fertility choice see it as a consumer choice. Basically, parents are choosing to have a kid as opposed to buying a BMW or something like that. It's really equivalent in terms of how it's formulated. And so I think a huge conceptual step forward in thinking about macroeconomic management is redefining maybe not all of those types of expenditures of time and money, but a large portion of them as investments that have long run implications for economic performance relative to consumption expenditures. I tend to refer to them as investments or relative instead of infrastructure necessarily. Either term probably would work. And so I think, you know, the policies of the Biden administration are a real step forward in terms of actually recognizing that. I don't think that the scale really matches the scale of what these investments are actually worth. You know, when we actually like monetize them and look at them and you compare, you know, that 20 to 40% of GDP to, you know, what is actually being proposed by the Biden administration, it's probably going to look a little like a drop in the bucket if you actually, you know, can compare the monetary values. But I think that the change to discussing it in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investment, is something durable, not something as fleeting, is very important. And the policy change is a move in the right direction.
Indeed. Well, that was certainly, I mean, it's as though you've been part of a conversation with other colleagues this week about the financial commitments from the Biden administration around care as infrastructure, and it relates to a question that's just come in from Sue L about the levers for activist individuals and organisations to push for more significant change to make the economy serve populations rather than the other way around. And so what we've seen in just the last weeks, you know, money going towards supporting civil society engagement from the Biden administration, and this is absolutely what we're about again at WISE and our work with the women's budget groups and the work led by Professor Diane Ailsa on the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. We could keep this conversation going, James, for a lot longer than we have, and we're completely out of time now tonight, which I'm sorry about. But we have to keep the conversation going on all the provocations that you've raised with us tonight. The other questions that have been coming through around liberalising migration policy, seeing that as part of the global care economy, as well as the overlapping generation models and what that means for private financing. And the last point you were making there about, you know, infrastructure versus investment, and unpicking really what that means in public policy terms, and then taking that back to, and how do we continue that activism for policy change and for different outcomes. So the last word really is to say 2 words, James. Thank you. Thank you so much for the time and preparation for the lecture. To thank everybody for coming along to the Ailsa McKay Memorial Lecture from the WISE Centre for Economic Justice. There will be a recording made available on the GCU YouTube channel. That's not terribly easy to say. My thanks, enormous thanks to Alison Lockhart at WISE for making everything happen behind the scenes the way Alison always does, and to Lynn Robertson for all the tech support and prior support to making the lecture go, I think, without a glitch tonight or this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are. Whatever time of day it is, I hope you have a safe and enjoyable rest of your day. And James, I really, really hope we can share a beer and keep going this conversation sometime very, very soon. Take care, and thank you very, very much, James.
Thank you, Angela. It was great fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Until the next time. Thank you, everybody, and bye for now.